when Donald Duck first appeared in the animated shorts, he had a very distinct personality.
In the films, Donald Duck served as a kind of constant boiling over temper tantrum. He was the guy who was always just blowing his top right away and usually making the situation worse.
In the comics, the stories were more complex and layered and textured. And Donald's personality could be played out a little more.
Donald Duck, who was such a difficult character on screen because nobody understood what he was saying, didn't have to worry about that anymore. He was a character who could say whatever he said in the speech bubbles. It's almost as though the artists and the writers of those comic books were able to take this extraordinary character and put him into situations which would be quite absurd for anybody, let alone a duck in a sailor suit, and make them actually emotionally engaging.
The first Disney comic strips appeared in newspapers on January 13th, 1930. That's when the Mickey Mouse Daily Strip began. Al Taliaferro, with Ted Osborne, then began to work on the Silly Symphony Sunday color comic strip. The Silly Symphony Sunday strip rotating system where whatever characters were current on the screen would be the star of the strip for a certain period of time. And so from September 1934, shortly after the release of Donald's first cartoon, The Wise Little Hen, there was a Wise Little Hen-based continuity in the Silly Symphony Sunday. Shortly after that time, Donald became a character in the Mickey Mouse Daily Strip. Taliaferro personally wanted to make Donald into a solo star. And so, after a lot of back and forth in the comic strip department, Donald became the temporary star of the Silly Symphony strip.
Those strips were popular enough to be printed in a new comic book from Western Publishing.
And so, for the first time, there was a 64-page, standard format, full-color Donald Duck comic book on the newsstands, and the sales blew Western away. So in October 1940, the Mickey Mouse magazine became Walt Disney's Comics and Stories. Suddenly, Disney had another major breakaway star besides Mickey Mouse and Goofy. In 1941, Western Publishing had run through the daily strips. They'd run through the Donald dedicated Sundays and the Donald Silly Symphony Sundays. They needed to produce more Donald Duck material. The Disney studio decided to raid its unproduced feature film called Morgan's Ghost, also known as Pieces of Eight. From the Ducks story department, Carl Barks and Jack Hanna were put to work at drawing the story. And so this 64-page original Donald adventure, the first long Donald story to be produced in the United States, appeared and was a huge success.
When Carl Barks left the shorts department and got into comics, he became the writer and artist of Donald Duck stories. And he expanded on Donald's animation personality in the comic book format. He could tell longer stories, better stories, deeper stories.
And so from April 1943, Walt Disney's Comics and Stories began to feature these original Donald Duck 10-page stories that Carl Barks was producing.
As a result of longer stories being developed, there was a need to expand the cast of characters.
And within the first year, Barks created this classic, big, fat lummox antagonist for Donald named Neighbor Jones, guy living next door. From Jones, Barks progressed to creating the greatest of the Donald Duck supporting characters.
Donald Duck's rich Uncle Scrooge McDuck first appeared in 1947.
Here was a guy who had more money than anybody could ever spend in a million lifetimes, and he was the cheapest cheapskate on the planet.
He would do anything for a dime or a nickel. And you contrast that with Donald, who had nothing. No matter how hard he tried, he had nothing. And Gladstone Gander, he was the luckiest duck in the world. He could do no wrong. He'd throw away a lottery ticket and 2 other lottery tickets would blow in his face and he'd win twice the amount.
Back in the early Taliaferro Silly Symphony Sunday strips, Taliaferro suggested some nephews to pester Donald.
The nephews were always more competent and clever than Donald in every way. Another character that Barks created was Gyro Gearloose.
Gyro Gearloose is a crazy inventor, and he'd make these Rube Goldberg-type inventions.
But they never quite do what they're supposed to.
Dick Kinney created a number of pesky characters to work with Donald. These characters were much better known outside the United States, and they reflected the growing importance of Disney comics in the foreign markets. Maybe the most famous Kinney pest was Feathery Duck, Donald's new age, nerdy cousin.
From there, we moved on to some memorable Carl Barks villains.
The Beagle Boys were a gang of inveterate prison dwellers who were always getting out. It became a personal challenge for them to get Scrooge's money. Donald would be brought into those adventures to try and help him out.
We had Magica Dispel, a sorceress who was after Scrooge's first dime that he ever earned. We had Flintheart Glomgold, who, where Scrooge was the richest duck in the world, he was the second richest duck, and he would stop at nothing to become #1. And the best character, I think, to emerge in modern times, villain-wise, the international thief, the Black Knight, who a successful theft from Scrooge is a status symbol for him. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, the split between the screen Donald and the comics Donald became more pronounced than ever. In the 1950s, he settled into his classic screen battles with Chip and Dale, with Spike the Bee. And in the comics, they split him almost into 2 characters. A suburban everyman with the everyday frustrations, and an heroic, though sometimes reluctant, adventurer.
Donald Duck actually had long-form adventure stories in Europe before he had anything similar in the United States. In the mid to late 1930s, a fellow named Federico Pedroschi began to write and draw his own long Donald adventures that were serialized week by week. The first one was called Donald Duck and the Secret of Mars. In the 1940s, you would see Donald in grand adventures like The Mummy's Ring from Carl Barks.
In the Cold War era, we had a story titled The 24-Carat Moon, which involved a tiny planetoid of pure gold hidden behind the as of yet unseen dark side of the moon, to which Uncle Scrooge and Donald and other tycoons and villains have their own space race to claim that planet.
In the States, in the 40s and 50s, the Duck comics were selling 3 million copies a month.
And those millions of copies were being passed from reader to reader. So hundreds of millions of people probably read those over those years.
Donald Duck comic books in Europe maintained a similar popularity level, increasing to a kind of peak in the mid-1950s. In the early 1960s, however, the American comics began to see a bit of a slump. As the Western Disney comics became more childlike in tone, the opportunity was opened for the foreign comics to begin producing more Donald Duck material of their own.
Europe developed many great artists to carry on the tradition that was begun by Barks, Tony Strobel, and others.
Marco Rota, one of the greatest talents from Italy of the period, who created Night of the Saracen in 1983.
Marco Rota could do big action scenes like a cataclysmic tidal wave like no one else could.
The greatest of the Italian innovations of the time, though, came in 1969 when Elisa Penna, an editor there at Mondadori, felt that Donald was not heroic enough. She wanted to do sort of superhero stories with Donald when she put Guido Martina and a number of artists to work on creating a series that was called Peperinik, and later became known in the U.S. as Duck Avenger. These were stories where Donald accidentally became the owner of a mansion that was once owned by a super spy. Donald learned that all of the super secret fighting gear was stored in the basement of this old mansion, and that by wearing this stuff, Donald could actually become a kind of superhero.
The European market could definitely be given credit for saving the comics because as the American market declined, the Europeans stepped up and really filled that void and often surpassed many of the things we did, particularly in Denmark, the Netherlands, and in Italy.
Huge amounts of really brilliant Donald stories were produced and sort of created a second golden age of Donald stories that came back and cross-pollinated to the United States.
A great deal of the success of the Donald Duck comics was that both the humor and the adventure found in them was universal. The universality of the story itself is what made it succeed.
The story of Disney Comics may not be one of conscious international collaboration, but it is one of kindred spirits collaborating over the decades.
The Disney characters, and especially Donald, allow people from almost any culture to identify with these very basic human motivations and frustrations. These characters, they're eternally fresh. Their world is not limited to any time period.
Maybe what we really see in the comic book is the private lives of these characters. In a sense, I think that's almost their true persona. Having all these wonderful adventures, and then every now and again they had to go to Hollywood and make one of these little movies for Walt Disney.